Have you ever caught yourself replaying the same thought over and over again, like a broken record stuck on the same line? You try to sleep, but your brain won't stop. You try to focus, but your mind keeps dragging you back to that one "what if," or that one thing you should have said. If this sounds like you, know this: you're not broken. You're human. And more importantly, you're not alone. Today's talk is not just about psychology, it's about freedom. Freedom from a habit that quietly steals our peace: overthinking. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time we bust a major myth. Overthinking is not who you are. It's simply what your brain has gotten used to doing. So many people say things like, "I'm just an overthinker," as if it's a permanent part of their personality. But psychological science tells us something powerful. Overthinking is a learned habit, not an identity. And what's learned can be unlearned. Let's understand how. From the moment we are born, our brains are trained to look for patterns, solve problems, and protect us from danger. This is helpful until the brain becomes too good at solving problems, especially those that don't even exist yet. That's when overthinking begins. Overthinking usually starts subtly. Maybe you experienced failure once and decided to never let it happen again. Maybe someone's silence made you feel rejected, and you vowed to be more careful next time. Gradually, your mind built a pattern. If I just think enough, I can avoid pain. But here's what psychology reveals. Overthinking does not prevent pain. It prolongs it. Research in cognitive behavioral psychology shows that overthinking is not a conscious choice, but a mental loop, a pattern that becomes automatic over time. Just like a muscle that's trained through repetition, overthinking becomes our mind's default setting. And guess what? It gets reinforced the more we allow it. So how does this happen? Every time we replay a conversation in our head or worry endlessly about the future, our brain releases stress hormones. This tells the nervous system that there's a threat. Even when there's no real danger, the brain, wanting to help us survive, thinks, let's think more. Let's prepare for every scenario. So we think harder, longer, and get stuck deeper. But psychologists have discovered something incredible. The brain has neuroplasticity. That means we can rewire our mental habits. We can interrupt the loop. But before we get to that, it's important to shift our mindset. You see, when we identify ourselves as overthinkers, we give power to the habit. It's like calling yourself a smoker when you're trying to quit. Your brain starts believing that this is who you are, not just what you do. But psychology urges us to reframe this. Instead of saying, "I'm an overthinker," try saying, "My mind has developed the habit of overthinking, and I'm learning to change that." This simple shift turns a passive identity into an active process. And here's the good news. Psychology gives us tools to interrupt the habit loop. The first step is awareness. Recognize when you're stuck in the loop. Awareness lights up a different part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thinking and decision-making. This helps override the emotional center, the amygdala, which usually keeps us trapped in fear-based thoughts. Once you're aware, the next step is disruption. Something as simple as standing up, taking a deep breath, or saying out loud, "This is overthinking," creates just enough distance to weaken the pattern. And finally, you replace the pattern with action, with a question, or even with silence. You choose not to follow the thought. Remember, every time you refuse to follow the same mental path, you weaken it. That's how new neural pathways are formed. Overthinking is not about being weak, dramatic, or emotional. It's a mental reflex, and like all reflexes, it can be reconditioned. In fact, many high achievers, artists, and leaders are recovering overthinkers. They've learned how to use self-awareness and mental discipline to master their minds instead of being mastered by them. You can too, but it all begins with one truth. You are not your thoughts. You are the one observing them. And once you accept that overthinking is a habit, not your destiny, then you've already taken the first step to healing. So, the next time your mind starts spinning with questions, scenarios, and imagined disasters, pause, breathe, and remind yourself, this is not who I am. This is just a habit I'm learning to break. Thinking isn't the problem. The problem begins when thinking never stops. Overthinking feels like carrying the weight of 100 conversations in your head, all happening at once. You replay what you said. You imagine what they meant. You plan your reaction for something that hasn't even happened. And the worst part? You know you're overthinking. But you can't stop. Psychology explains this through a concept known as cognitive distortions, unhealthy patterns of thinking that warp your perception of reality. These are not conscious choices. They're mental habits formed over time, usually without you even realizing it. Let's take a few examples. One of the most common distortions is catastrophizing, automatically assuming the worst-case scenario. You make a small mistake at work, and your brain says, "I'm going to get fired." Or someone doesn't text back, and you jump to, "They hate me." Your mind leaps into disaster mode, not because you're irrational, but because it's been trained by fear. Then there's mind reading, assuming you know what others are thinking. You enter a room and someone looks at you briefly, and your mind goes, "They're judging me. They must think I'm not good enough." No words were spoken, no facts were exchanged, yet your brain fills in the blanks with worst-case thoughts. Another trap is what if thinking. What if I fail? What if they leave? What if it all goes wrong? These thoughts don't solve problems. They multiply them. They leave you exhausted, anxious, and emotionally drained without anything to show for it. Cognitive distortions are like smudge glasses. They blur your vision and make everything seem more threatening than it really is. And the more you wear them, the more they become your normal. You stop questioning them and start believing them. Over time, these thinking patterns become a loop, a small trigger, like an awkward interaction or an uncertain future event, activates the brain's threat system. This lights up the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear and survival instincts. Once this happens, your brain starts scanning for more danger, more things to worry about, and then you fall into what psychologists call a rumination cycle. Rumination is when you think the same thought over and over, believing that somehow, by thinking more, you'll find relief. But the truth is, the more you think, the deeper you sink. Your brain doesn't find answers. It finds more fear. Here's the thing. Overthinking isn't intelligence gone wrong. It's your brain trying to protect you, but in the wrong way. It believes that if it can predict every possible outcome, it can keep you safe. But the irony is, this need for control creates chaos. What keeps this going is the belief that you have to figure everything out right now, that you must be ready for every possibility, that if you stop thinking, you'll make a mistake or something bad will happen. But psychology teaches us the opposite. Sometimes, letting go of thought is the only way to see clearly. In therapy, especially in cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, the first step is recognizing the distortion. You learn to pause and ask, is this thought a fact or a fear? Is there evidence or just emotion? That awareness itself creates space. It shifts your thinking from automatic reaction to conscious observation. Let's say someone didn't respond to your message. Your automatic thought is, they're ignoring me. I did something wrong. But when you slow it down, you ask, what proof do I have? Could they be busy? Am I making an assumption? This reprogramming doesn't happen overnight. But with practice, you start catching your mind before it spirals. You learn to question the story instead of getting lost in it. Another key point from psychology, your thoughts are not always true. They are just suggestions. Some are useful, many are not. And once you realize that, you stop reacting to every mental alarm your brain sets off. Think of your brain like a news channel. Not every headline is worth believing. Not every story deserves your attention. Some thoughts are just noise, and learning to tune them out is a skill. What matters is that you don't blame yourself for overthinking. This is not about weakness. It's about awareness. It's about understanding that your brain learns certain habits in order to feel safe. And now, with new knowledge, you can teach it new ways to cope. When you begin to notice your cognitive distortions, when you start identifying catastrophizing, mind reading, black and white thinking, and all or nothing conclusions, you take the first step toward peace. Because awareness brings control, and control brings calm. You are not broken. You are just human. A human mind is powerful, but like any tool, it needs guidance. And the more you practice separating fact from fear, the more your mind begins to heal. Overthinking is not a sign, that you think too much. It's a sign that you're not thinking in the right direction. But the direction can always change. And that change starts now with one simple decision. I will no longer believe everything I think. Why do we overthink in the first place? Why does a human mind, which is so intelligent, capable of solving complex problems, and dreaming about the stars, suddenly become its own worst enemy when faced with a simple decision or a moment of uncertainty? Psychology has a powerful explanation for this. Overthinking isn't just overanalyzing. It's a mental reaction to something deeper. Fear of uncertainty. The human brain is wired to seek control. It wants to predict outcomes. It wants to prepare for danger, real or imagined. And in this attempt to feel safe, the mind keeps running loops of what if, maybe, and should I? This is especially strong when you're dealing with emotional uncertainty. For example, you're waiting for a reply from someone you care about. Logically, you know they may just be busy. But emotionally, you start wondering if they're ignoring you, if you said something wrong, if something bad is about to happen. And the mind, looking for answers, keeps spinning. That spinning is the brain's attempt to create control. Even if control is imaginary, the roots of this behavior often trace back to early emotional experiences. If you grew up in an environment where mistakes were punished harshly or love was unpredictable, your mind may have learned to always stay alert, always analyze, always anticipate. It's a defense mechanism. Overthinking becomes a form of self-protection. The problem is, over time, this protection turns into a prison. The brain, instead of protecting you from emotional pain, traps you in constant mental noise. You stop living in the moment and start living in your head. You stop trusting your instincts. And worse, you stop trusting yourself. This leads us to one of the biggest psychological blocks that fuels overthinking: lack of self-trust. The deeper reason why people overthink isn't because they have too many thoughts. It's because they don't trust themselves enough to make a decision and stand by it. They feel they must review every possible outcome, consider every perspective, and anticipate every failure before they act. Because if they're wrong, they don't know how to forgive themselves. So they think and think and think until the moment passes. This is a mental loop that never ends on its own. Because here's the harsh truth: the mind never runs out of what-ifs. There will always be another angle, another possibility, another scenario. If you're waiting for the perfect clarity before making a move or finding peace, you might wait forever. Psychology tells us that the only way to break this cycle is to stop chasing perfect control and start building emotional resilience. Resilience means you trust yourself enough to know, even if things don't go perfectly, you'll handle it. Even if you make a wrong choice, it won't destroy you. Even if uncertainty scares you, you don't have to solve everything right now. This is how we begin to calm the overthinking mind, not by thinking harder, but by feeling safer inside ourselves. One psychological approach that explains this well is acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. It teaches that instead of fighting your thoughts, you accept them. You say, yes, I'm feeling uncertain. Yes, I don't know what will happen, but I choose to move forward anyway. You make peace with discomfort instead of trying to eliminate it, because the more we try to eliminate discomfort through overthinking, the more anxious we become. It's also important to understand how the brain rewards overthinking. At first, when you replay a conversation or plan every detail of tomorrow's meeting, you feel like you're being responsible. You feel like you're preparing. But that's a false sense of productivity. In reality, you're just exhausting your mental energy without progress. The brain gets addicted to this cycle because every time you worry, it gives you the illusion of being in control. But true control isn't thinking more. It's knowing when to stop. So, what can you do when your brain starts looping? Psychologists recommend a powerful phrase: I don't need to know everything right now. This reminds a mind that uncertainty isn't dangerous. It's just uncomfortable, and you can survive discomfort. Another tool is to ask yourself, what am I afraid would happen if I stop thinking about this? Often, the answer is something like, I might miss something important, or I'll be unprepared, or I'll make the wrong choice. These are fears, not facts. And recognizing the difference is key. Your brain doesn't need to solve life in advance. It needs to feel safe with not knowing everything. And safety, my friend, doesn't come from certainty. It comes from trust. Trust in yourself, trust in the process, and trust that even if things go wrong, you will still be okay. Overthinking happens when we believe we must solve every unknown. But the truth is, peace begins when we accept that not every unknown is a threat. Some things are simply part of life. Unpredictable, messy, imperfect, and still survivable. That's the shift psychology invites us to make. From control to courage, from fear to faith, and from mental chaos to inner calm. One of the most effective psychological techniques to manage and eventually stop overthinking comes from a well-established and research-backed method known as cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. It's not just a clinical approach used by therapists. It's a mindset and a set of tools that anyone can use, even in everyday life. At the heart of CBT lies a simple but life-changing truth. Not all your thoughts are true. Overthinking often begins when we mistake thoughts for facts. Something happens. Maybe someone says something critical or you make a small mistake, and your mind instantly fills in the blanks. I must have ruined everything. They probably hate me now. I'm never going to succeed. These thoughts feel true. They come with emotion, with fear, with regret. So we don't question them. We just accept them, absorb them, and replay them. Overthinking is born in that moment, when the brain chooses to believe a distortion rather than investigate the truth. Cognitive restructuring, a technique taught in CBT, trains you to do the opposite. Instead of reacting to a thought, you analyze it. You treat it like a scientist treats a hypothesis. You test it. You ask questions. You challenge it. For example, let's say your thought is, "I always mess things up." Cognitive restructuring invites you to pause and ask, "Is that really true? Always? Can I think of even one time I didn't mess up? What's the evidence for this thought? What's the evidence against it? What would I say to a friend if they said this about themselves?" This mental process does something powerful. It breaks the automatic loop of overthinking and introduces logic where emotion had taken over. Because when you ask, "Is this always true?" you begin to realize that most overthinking is based on exaggeration, not reality. It's your fear talking, not facts. This isn't about pretending everything is fine. It's about seeing things clearly. Overthinking thrives in mental fog. Restructuring clears that fog. Psychologists have found that people who practice this kind of questioning regularly begin to experience a noticeable reduction in anxiety and overthinking. It's like giving your brain a new script, one that doesn't automatically jump to worst-case scenarios. But cognitive restructuring isn't just about replacing negative thoughts with positive ones. That's a common misconception. It's about replacing untrue thoughts with balanced ones. So instead of going from, "I always fail, I'm perfect at everything," you go from, "I always fail, sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail, just like everyone else." That kind of honesty grounds the mind. It reminds your nervous system that you're safe, that the world isn't black or white, and that mistakes aren't the end of the world. They're just part of being human. Overthinking feeds on extremes. Cognitive restructuring pulls you back to center. Another key aspect of this method is writing things down. When a thought keeps looping in your mind, put it on paper. Write down the thought, then challenge it using evidence. What you'll often discover is that the thought loses power the moment it's exposed to light. When thoughts stay in your head, they feel bigger than they are. But when you see them in black and white, you can observe them more objectively. You move from feeling the thought to seeing the thought, and that changes everything. Cognitive restructuring also teaches you to identify thinking traps, common patterns that most overthinkers fall into. Things like jumping to conclusions without proof, using absolute terms like always or never, blaming yourself for everything, expecting the worst with no real reason. Once you become aware of these traps, you start catching yourself in the act, and with awareness comes choice. You can either fall into the old loop or take a breath, step back, and choose a healthier response. With time and practice, this becomes second nature. What once triggered hours of mental spiraling might now only cause a pause, a brief moment of reflection, followed by peace. And here's the real beauty of it all. You don't have to eliminate overthinking in one day. You just have to interrupt it, one thought at a time. You build a new habit of questioning, a habit of challenging, a habit of not believing every fearful story your mind tells you. This is what psychological growth looks like. Not perfection, but progress. Not a silent mind, but a trained one. Overthinking doesn't end because the world gets simpler. It ends because you get stronger. Stronger in awareness. Stronger in logic. Stronger in knowing that you have tools. And you can use them. That is the essence of cognitive restructuring. Learning that you are not powerless against your thoughts. You can respond, you can reframe, and with time you can rise above them. There's a pattern that almost every overthinker falls into. The loop between endless thoughts and no action. You feel stuck. You analyze, dissect, and imagine every possible outcome, but in the end, nothing really changes. The moment passes. The decision remains unmade. The opportunity is lost, and you're left with frustration and self-blame. This is where psychology offers one of its most practical insights. Overthinking is not just a thinking problem. It's often an action problem. You see, the human brain doesn't like unfinished business. When there's a decision to make or a problem to solve and no action is taken, the mind keeps spinning. Try to solve it by thinking alone. But thoughts without action don't create resolution. They create rumination. One of the most effective ways to interrupt overthinking is not by trying to control your thoughts, but by shifting your focus to action, even if the action is small. Psychologists call this behavioral activation. It's a technique often used to treat depression and anxiety, but it works just as powerfully for people trapped in mental loops. The idea is simple. Instead of waiting for motivation or clarity, you act first, because action generates momentum, and momentum quiets the noise. When you take even a small step toward a decision or goal, your brain receives feedback. Something is happening. I'm not stuck anymore. That breaks the mental cycle of helplessness that fuels overthinking. For example, if you've been overthinking a conversation you need to have, write the first line. If you're stuck on making a career decision, research one option for 15 minutes. If you can't stop thinking about a mistake, write down what you learned from it. These are not life-changing moves in themselves, but they create movement, and movement is the enemy of mental paralysis. Another reason this works is because the brain associates action with control. Remember, overthinking often stems from a fear of losing control. When you act, even in small, intentional ways, you give yourself a sense of agency. You tell your brain, I'm not just reacting, I'm responding. That shift from reaction to response is what gives you your power back. Psychologists also recommend setting clear mental boundaries around when and how long you allow yourself to think about something. A very practical technique is called the worry timer. Here's how it works. You schedule a 10 or 15-minute window in your day where you allow yourself to fully think through a problem. You can write your thoughts, speak them aloud, or just sit quietly and let the mind run. But once the timer is up, that's it. You close the notebook or you move on to the next task. This technique teaches the brain that worrying is not an all-day event. It's a contained activity, and that containment is deeply calming to the nervous system. You're not suppressing thoughts, you're managing them. Another strategy rooted in psychology is asking yourself one key question. What is the smallest next step I can take? Overthinkers often wait until they feel completely certain, completely confident, or completely ready before taking action. But that moment rarely comes. Clarity doesn't precede action. Clarity comes from action. When you make one phone call, write one email, take one deep breath before answering someone, you're sending your brain a message. We're not just stuck thinking about it. We're doing something. And that doing rewires the way your brain handles fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It builds emotional resilience. Here's something else psychology teaches us, and it's worth repeating. The brain will always try to choose what feels safe, and often, thinking feels safer than doing, because thinking happens in your head, where you can't fail, where you can't be judged, where you don't have to risk discomfort. But it also keeps you distant from change, growth, and real peace. Action, on the other hand, is vulnerable. It asks you to face outcomes, to deal with the unknown, to move even if you're unsure. but it's also where healing begins. Action is where the overthinking ends and the real learning starts. You don't have to take big leaps. In fact, the brain responds better to small, repeated steps. That's how habits are formed. That's how fear gets replaced with confidence. That's how a noisy mind begins to quiet itself, through proof. So the next time you find yourself trapped in a loop of thoughts, ask yourself, what's one small thing I can do? Not tomorrow, not later, but right now? And then do it. Not because it solves everything, but because it changes something. Overthinking loses its power when we stop waiting to feel perfect and start trusting that progress is enough, because it is. So now, after everything we've explored, from understanding overthinking as a habit, to identifying distorted thoughts, facing our fear of uncertainty, applying cognitive restructuring, and finally learning to act, one truth becomes clear: overthinking doesn't make your life safer. It just makes your mind heavier. Psychology doesn't promise a silent mind. It offers a trained one, a mind that knows how to pause, how to question, how to return to balance. A mind that doesn't chase control and chaos, but finds clarity and awareness. And most importantly, this journey is not about eliminating thoughts. It's about changing your relationship with them. To stop overthinking is not to stop thinking. It's to stop believing every fearful thought as if it were the truth. You now know that overthinking is not who you are. It's something your mind learned. And just like any habit, it can be unlearned. You are not powerless in front of your thoughts. You have tools. You have awareness. And now you have choice. So the next time your mind begins to spiral, breathe, pause, observe, act gently, trust yourself. Because your peace doesn't depend on solving every problem. Sometimes your peace begins when you stop trying to solve everything at once and just begin living one moment at a time. Thank you